Alright, so last video we were talking about the Endangered Species Act and the classification levels given to species. And as we saw, there's a bunch of species in the United States that are sitting at threatened and endangered. Let me give you guys some numbers here. Let me add a slide in. We'll just call them U.S. species of concern. There's about, and these numbers are moving target, but about 1,372 species that are threatened or endangered. All right, so that's current number. There's roughly another 550, so let's say about 550 that are under consideration, that they're being analyzed. They're looking at the classification status and during population surveys and things like that to say, do these also get added to the endangered or threatened species list? That's in the US. When we talk about global, the IUCN organization, the International Union for Conservation of Nature, globally we're looking at about 23,500 species that are threatened and endangered. 23,500. That's what's sitting on the IUCN Red List right now. So if you guys Google IUCN Red List, it takes you out there. You can look up species, figure out what their status is. That's a big number. That's a scary number. And those numbers keep growing. Every 5 years we reevaluate because it takes time to study to see is the population going up or down. And every 5 years the number of total species continues to go up. So the challenge is, once a species gets listed as threatened or endangered, how do you get this off the list? How do you remove it? Now in the US, when a species is listed and it makes a list, the Fish and Wildlife Service will develop a recovery plan. So that's what they're going to do, is they're going to say, okay, here's this new species or a species that's on the list. We need to establish a recovery plan to get that species off the list. So when we're working with endangered species and species of concern, recovery plans are incredibly important. So let's take a look at a recovery plan. So here's a challenge. This takes a lot of money. Sadly, it takes a lot of money to save a species. So funding is often tied to emotion. Not so much biology, not so much ecology, but emotion. Can you tug at the heartstrings of people to get them to donate thousands and thousands or millions of dollars for recovery plans? So when we're doing recovery plans, we look at different types of species that have different kind of categories. First of all, they're endangered, but is it a keystone species, indicator, umbrella, or flagship species? And we'll get into the differences in a second. So you have to be very, very smart with which species you're promoting to the public that you're trying to save with your recovery plan. So imagine those two species down there, pandas and mud puppies. Will you donate $2 million to save a mud puppy? Probably not. Would you donate $2 million to save a panda? Well, look how cute they are. We got movies about them, Kung Fu Panda, and all these characteristics we attribute to them. Cute, cuddly, beautiful animals, and they are. That's tugging at the heartstrings. All right. So some terms we want to get familiar with that become part of recovery plans when we're assessing which species to kind of highlight in a recovery plan. First term is keystone species. so a keystone species helps maintain the biodiversity of an ecosystem or of a community. So critically important species here because they do so much to maintain and keep stability in a community. Is that the best species to present to the public? Maybe, maybe not. Depends on what the keystone is. If the keystone's a mud puppy, probably not. If the keystone is a jaguar, yeah, that's cool. We want to save jaguars. That gets a lot of emotion going when you talk about save the jaguar versus save the mud puppy. So you need to understand the keystone, and that's going to vary from community to community. Sometimes we use that as our species that we present to the public for recovery. Indicator species. Indicator species are often species that are tied to environmental conditions. Hey, you got good water if this species is here. You have bad water if the species isn't here. So, again, tug at the emotions. Euglena, the little green protists with the red eye spot, with the little flagella that swim around in pond water, nobody's going to care about that. But you talk about brook trouts, honeybees. Ooh, now we're getting somewhere. Now we're getting a little more emotional. Okay? So, again, indicator species critical to understand the health of an ecosystem. But is it the best one to present in your recovery plan? Umbrella species. Okay, so umbrella species are species that need large blocks of habitat to survive and to maintain breeding populations, or a breeding population. Grizzly bear, that's an umbrella species. That can also be a keystone species. That one can tug at heartstrings, save the grizzly. So could a jaguar. So again, we need to be selective with what species we're promoting as the one we're trying to save. And then the last one is the flagship species. Flagship species is one that produces an emotional response that really tugs at the heartstrings. That gets people go, oh, we don't want to see them disappear. What can we do to save that species? So we need to be aware of how we would classify it, keystone, indicator, umbrella, and really focus on trying to use those species in our recovery plans so we can draw public support. Because somebody who cancels funding for Save the Panda, they're going to get some major public backlash. But if they say, hey, you canceled funding for Save the Salamander or Save the Mud Puppy or Save the Euglena, people are going to go, who cares about that stuff? It's not something we care about anyway. So get comfortable with these terms. Make sure we can come up with an example of a species that fits each of these terms. All right, so now what we're going to do is take it to the next step and say, all right, how do we preserve habitat? Because that is the number one issue. The number one problem is habitat issues. Private land is absolutely important. Get private landowners involved in these programs, but you have to convince them why you should be involved in it. Often there's a financial issue associated with it. Are they going to lose money if they take their farm ground out of production and turn it into pollinator programs and things like that? So we have to be able to talk to them about here's the emotional reasons, but also here's the financial reasons, and get private support. We can't do this with public. We can't do all of this with public land. We need lots and lots of private land. So often we'll come up with things called habitat conservation plans, HCPs. These are agreements between the landowner and a state or federal agency. So you could do it with the state of Illinois. You could do this with the Fish and Wildlife Service. You could do it with national organizations, where you come up with some kind of agreement, and say, okay, how do we work together to preserve this land that will benefit species? So CRP, Conservation Reserve Program, is a federal program that will pay landowners to take cropland out of production and say, okay, turn this 40 acres of fields into prairie, restore it back to prairie. Huge benefit environmentally, but the farmer is losing 40 acres of revenue in the agricultural world, so often they're paid. Depending on the program, in general though, the payment isn't equal to what they could make farming, but in today's climate, farming is a difficult project or difficult occupation, and the revenue is not good for farmers. So the conversation might be, when you talk with a farmer, diversify. Put 10% of your farm into CRP, your guaranteed revenue. It's not as much as you might make with agriculture, but you don't have the expenses associated with agriculture. You don't have the risk of the market going up and down, trade wars, all those issues we're seeing in agriculture right now. So that sometimes becomes a very powerful incentive for a farmer or a landowner to move some of their property into a conservation plan. So get private people involved. We don't have enough public land to do this in the big picture, so we definitely need private land to assist with it. So when we start doing this, when we start putting things into protection, we need to do a gap analysis of the species, of the community, of the biome, whatever you want to call it, depending on how big the project is, and figure out what is the best place to work. So what a gap analysis will do, it will look for unprotected areas it's going to look for unprotected areas that house high biodiversity. So you got a lot of species in this area. It's not protected right now. Maybe we need to readjust our protected areas. So here's an example of one of the islands on Hawaii, or one of the Hawaiian islands. And you go, okay, the green shows the preserves, but look at all these areas next to it that have different endangered species. They're not in the preserve. So if your preserves are great, but is it possible to get some of those other areas involved in it? Involved in protection? Because you're going to actually save more species by getting some of these other areas. Let me get the pen out. So imagine if you could convince the landowner here to do something, or landowners, say, can we put all of this into preserve and it'd connect into the two existing preserves? Can we do a habitat conservation plan right here with that chunk right there? Think about the value that would have. You got a lot of species there, and you're tying it together with other preserves. So now you're building a bigger preserve. You're linking small pieces together. The bigger the habitat, the bigger the continuous habitat, the better it's going to be for species preservation. And we talk a bit about edge effect. A bunch of small fragmented pieces, this, even if they're connected by little corridors, this kind of stuff is not nearly as good as one solid piece that equals the same square area, because there's edge effect around all of this, where here your edge effect is limited. It's not nearly as problematic. So gap analysis becomes really, really important and a critical piece of information. GIS programming is huge when we get into gap analysis. So all of you should be taking a GIS course at some point in your biology career. All right, so what we'll talk about in the last lecture here are the management principles when we really build our plan.